When we last left the Hardys, they had returned to the cabin to find it empty. Chapter 13. A Fight in the Dark. "We're too late," Frank muttered in a choking voice. Joe was too stunned to speak. The killer must have arrived before them. But where had the victims been taken? The next instant, the Hardys stiffened in suspense. Someone was slipping quietly into the cabin through the half-open front door. "Hey, you boys!" It was Hank Shale. Frank and Joe rushed to question him. "What happened to Dad?" Joe exclaimed. "Don't worry, your pa's safe," the Westerner assured them. "I was just moving him to Ben Tinker's place." A wave of relief swept over the boys. "Did you know he was in danger?" Frank asked. "We figured so. After I told him how Big Al's men tried to get you lads, your pa had a hunch the gang might come after him next." His hunch was right, Joe said. Big Al's spy was ordered to kill Dad tonight. "By jingo! He took cover just in time." Hank listened intensely as the boy related their latest adventures. "We better not wait any longer," Frank declared. "The killer may make his move at any time now. Hank, you better go back to Ben's place and stand guard." "What about you two?" "We'll wait here at the cabin and see if Slip Gun shows up," Frank replied. "And if he does," Joe declared, "we'll have him dead to rights." "Now, hold on," said Hank. "If this feller's coming to kill your pa, he'll be armed. It'll be plumb foolish to try and take him out alone." "Then we'll wait outside and just see who he is," Frank promised hastily. "The rest can be handled later." Hank started back to Ben Tinker's. Meanwhile, Joe lighted the oil lamp and the boys rummaged quickly through their father's gear for extra flashlights to replace the ones they had lost in the river. Then they extinguished the lamp and hurried outside. After stabling their horses in the lean-to, without taking time to unsaddle them, the boys darted into a nearby clump of trees. They picked out a spot from which they could watch the front door of the cabin and waited. For the next quarter of an hour, nothing disturbed the peaceful quiet of the icy night. Suddenly, Frank gave a low hiss and pointed towards the cabin. The boys could barely discern the figure of a man moving silently. He tried the door cautiously, then slipped inside. "You think we should nab him?" Joe whispered. "We promised Hank we wouldn't," Frank righted his brother. "But don't worry. Once he comes back, we won't let him out of our sight till we've identified him. This time, he won't be giving us the slip." The boys fell silent as a faint glow of light showed through the cabin window. The glow moved about. Evidently, the intruder had brought a flashlight of his own. The Hardys stiffened in surprise as a second figure suddenly loomed in the darkness near the cabin. The newcomer halted for an instant, then moved swiftly towards the door and went inside. "Two of them," Joe gasped. A second later came a muffled outburst of voices. Then a sharp cry. Confused noises followed, then a crash. "There's fighting!" Frank sprang up. "Come on! That second person must have surprised the killer. He may need help." Joe followed his brother, sprinting from their hiding place. Frank reached the cabin first and tried to open the door, but it resisted his efforts, as if something were blocking it. Frank braced his shoulder and slammed hard against the wood. This time it yielded and came open part way. Wait a minute!" A voice just inside muttered thickly. The boys pushed on through and almost stumbled over someone on the floor. Frank snapped on his flashlight. Its bright beam revealed the face of Burke, the storekeeper. "Never mind me! Get him!" Burke rasped as he struggled to his feet. "He went through the back window!" Joe had already switched on his flashlight. As Burke spoke, the beam swept through the doorway and showed an open window. Joe darted out the front door and ran to the back of the cabin. Frank dashed straight to the bedroom and stuck his head out the window. Tracks were visible in the snow leading off towards the heavy brush and timber skirting the hillside. Joe came around the corner of the cabin, picked out the footprints with his beam of his flashlight, and began following them. "Hold it, Joe!" Frank called out. "That fellow may have a gun." Joe halted unwillingly and looked back at his brother. If he had a gun, wouldn't he have used it on Burke? How do we know? Frank argued. Maybe he had no chance to draw it before he knocked Burke down. And after hearing us at the door, he may have been more interested in making a getaway. Anyhow, don't risk it, Joe. Okay, Joe shrugged and returned to the cabin. By this time, Burke was sitting down, and Frank had righted the overturned tables and chairs. The storekeeper was disheveled and had a raw-looking bruise on his right cheek. "What happened?" Frank asked him. "I came here to see your boys or your dad," Burke replied. "Instead, I discovered Bob Dodge nosing around with a flashlight." "Dodge?" Frank and Joe exclaimed together. "You heard me," the storekeeper snapped. He rubbed his cheek gingerly. "I accused him of being a crook, and he slugged me with his flashlight. Then we started fighting. Finally, Dodge knocked me against the door, and before I could get up, he scrammed." "If Dodge had the flashlight, how could you see who he was?" Joe asked. "I couldn't at first," Burke explained. "I called out, 'Who are you?' or 'Who's there?' something like that. And then he started giving me some cock and bull story about looking for your dad, Hank Shale. I recognized the voice. I said, 'Don't try to kid me, Dodge. You're in with that gang Mr. Hardy's after.' And that's when he conked me with the flashlight." The boys looked at each other in bewilderment. "What made you suspect Dodge is in league with Big Al's gang?" Frank questioned. "'Cause I suddenly remembered him buying some red paint soon after your dad came to Lucky Load," Burke replied. "It slipped my mind when you boys asked me. That's what I was coming to tell you." Frank and Joe digested the startling news. Burke's story added up to a convincing case against Dodge. "Well, that would explain why he fled," Joe said. "If he figured the jig was up, Mr. Dodge may have headed for the gang's hideout. Or taken off in his copter," Frank exclaimed. "I'll see if it's still where he landed us." "We'll both go." "No need for that," his brother argued. "You better help Mr. Burke back to his store." From the quick look his brother flashed him, Joe guessed that Frank still mistrusted Burke and wanted to keep the man under surveillance. Burke, however, declined the offer. "Don't worry about me. I'm okay." The storekeeper stood up to go, but after taking a few steps he teetered and leaned weakly against the wall. "Whew," Burke muttered, shaking his head. "Guess I'm still a bit woozy from that clout Dodge gave me." Joe helped him back to the chair and then went for some water from the kitchen pump. Before leaving, Frank made an excuse to join Joe. "Take Burke to the store," he whispered. "Then go straight to Ben Tinker's and make sure Dad's okay. I'll meet you there." Frank went outside, got his horse from the lean-to, and rode toward the clearing where he had judged the helicopter was parked. Joe, meanwhile, bathed Burke's head with cold water and bandaged his injured cheek. "Where did your dad go?" Burke asked. He and Hank Shale are following a lead on the case," Joe said vaguely. He then suggested that they take the 2 remaining horses and ride rather than walk to the store. Burke shook his head. "It's not far enough to bother. Besides, the way I feel, I'm not sure I could stick into a saddle." Joe assisted him on foot to the store with no further difficulty. Burke thanked him, said good night, and went inside. Joe lingered until he saw the light go out. He then hurried to Ben Tinker's place. The young detective found Mr. Hardy, Hank, and Ben awake, gathered around a glowing potbelly stove. They listened with keen interest as Joe poured out a story of the night's events. Just as he was finishing, there came a sound of a horse being reined up outside, and a moment later, Frank burst into the cabin. "The helicopter's still at the field," Frank reported. "I scouted around a bit, but there's no sign of Dodge, and he hasn't returned to the hotel." Mr. Hardy frowned, stroked his jaw. "I find it hard to believe that Bob Dodge can be a criminal, much less a killer," the detective said. "What's your opinion, boys?" "Until tonight, he seemed to be a toss-up between Burke and Dodge. We've suspected one of them must be Big Al's spy ever since we trailed the hooded men to the general store." Frank nodded and tallied up the evidence. His father said, "Burke may be lying about what happened in the cabin tonight. Are you sure Dodge wasn't the second man to arrive?" "It was too dark to tell," Frank admitted, "but you're right. Dodge may have surprised Burke there and accused him of working with the gang, and Burke may have done the attacking but got knocked down." "In that case, why should Dodge duck out the window?" Hank objected. "Burke was blocking the door," Joe said. "Maybe Dodge was just deciding how to get out there fast enough in case Burke decided to come against him." Ben Tinker put in, "That still don't explain where he disappeared to." Mr. Hardy rose from his chair and paced back and forth. "The flashlight may carry fingerprints," he remarked. Was it still around? I didn't see it, Joe replied. Dodge must have taken it with him. But we don't know that, Frank emphasized. Burke could have slipped it inside his coat while we were looking out back. Joe agreed. We should have checked on that right away. Frank suddenly snapped his fingers. Let's assume Dodge is innocent. And if he got those burrs on his coat up at the cemetery, he must have been the third man, the one we heard behind us. Yes, and he may have spotted the blue signal light and gone to investigate just as we did. Right, Frank went on. So maybe Dodge suspected all along that Burke was the man who met Slim, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. And then he discovered Burke at the cabin tonight. He accused him outright, and Burke got panicky and jumped him. Ben Tinker grunted suspiciously. If Dodge suspected Burke, why didn't he tell you lads or your pa? Matter of fact, Dodge did come around yesterday, Hank reminded them, but the doc was tending to Fenton, and the boys weren't here, so he never got to talk to them. Maybe that's why Dodge came to the cabin tonight, to tell us his suspicions, Mr. Hardy conjectured. Has Burke ever been in trouble with the law, he asked. Hank and Ben replied that as far as they knew, he had not. Frank paced the floor. As things stand, we can make out a pretty convincing case for or against either Burke or Dodge, he stated. Dodge has disappeared, but Burke's still around. We may need some way to test Burke's innocence or guilt. Mr. Hardy nodded. Good thought. We know that the gang wants Joe and me out of the way, Frank went on, and we also know they're after Mike Onslow's lost gold. So let's set a trap for Burke. How? Joe asked. Frank grinned and said coolly, by using the best possible bait, the gold, and ourselves.